Before the tragedy of Grenfell, there was Ronan Point. Tower blocks have been a familiar sight on London's skyline for over half a century. Between the 1950s and 1970s, thousands of these towering structures were built across the UK, and around 42% of them were in London. In the aftermath of World War II, London was rebuilding for a bigger, brighter future. The population was booming, and the city faced a housing crisis. Tower blocks were seen as the perfect solution, a way to house as many people as they could in as little space as possible. Some buildings stretched 20, 30, even 40 stories tall, quickly becoming a defining feature of the capital. My great-grandmother lived in one of these blocks, and I still have family in them today. For many, they were a godsend. Modern, clean, warm housing where families could thrive. For others, they were regarded as modern slums that they felt they had no choice but to accept. The enormous grey concrete structures weren't only an eyesore, but they soon seemed to create more problems than they solved, with issues dating from when they were first built up to modern day. You'll all still clearly remember June of 2017 when the devastating news broke about a fire at Grenfell Tower, a 1970s block that had been recently renovated. The blaze destroyed most of the building and claimed 72 lives. It was a national tragedy. Activists are still fighting for justice, and it's since been decided that the site will become a memorial to those who were lost. But unfortunately, Grenfell wasn't the first time a London tower block made chilling headlines. Nearly 50 years earlier, another disaster shocked the nation and changed UK building regulations forever. This is the story of Ronan Point. In the early morning of May 16, 1968, Ivy Hodge woke up in her Ronan Point flat on the Freemasons estate and headed straight to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. But this familiar morning routine couldn't be more out of the ordinary as events took a terrifying turn. Miss Hodge had only just moved into her new home on the 18th floor of the 22-storey Ronan Point. Like many others, she had been excited to finally move in after a long wait on the housing list. She'd been busy buying new things and adding nice touches to her new place and was starting to feel at home. But nothing could have prepared her for what was going to happen that morning. At 5:45 a.m, Miss Hodge woke up as usual, went into her kitchen and filled up her kettle. She was about to put it on the stove, and the next thing she knew, she was suddenly flung backwards, flying through the air, and everything went blank. Miss Hodge's neighbours in the flats surrounding hers described the same moment as a deafening bang that shook the entire building, powerful enough to shake them out of bed in a panic. Nobody knew what was happening, but they instinctively grabbed their kids and ran for the exit. Many were up on the higher floors and had multiple flights of stairs to get down before they could reach safety. People were shouting through the hallways, warning each other not to use the lifts because of fears there was a fire. And once they finally did reach the bottom of the stairwell, residents reported being met with something unbelievable. They came face to face with a thick chain locking shut the double doors to the exit. Luckily, one heroic father managed to lift a very heavy rock and smash through the chain, freeing the group and allowing them to escape. Those still inside were baffled by what was happening. Peering out of their windows, all they could see was smoke. Then they looked at the ground and noticed that people had gathered, and they were frantically waving at them to come down. It wasn't until they got outside that they could finally see what was going on. Residents were met with a scene of chaos and were utterly gobsmacked to see that nearly half of the building had collapsed. Fortunately, 260 of Ronan Point's residents made it out safely, but tragically, 4 people instantly lost their lives. 17 others were injured, and the rest were left in shock and wondering what on earth had just happened. Rumours quickly spread. Some speculated it was a robbery gone wrong and that someone had tried to blow open a safe. Others blamed the construction itself, questioning whether the building had been built properly in the first place. Not all those who survived managed to escape via the stairs. One young mother found herself in the terrifying situation of being trapped on a tiny ledge as the room she was in fell apart and disappeared in front of her. Others reported one man miraculously gliding to the floor on his mattress after being thrown from the building as he slept. Apparently, he was even still asleep when he reached the ground and made it out with just a few scrapes. It wasn't long before the cause was discovered, and it all started with Miss Hodge on the 18th floor. As I mentioned earlier, she'd just moved in and had been buying some new things for her flat. And one of these new things was a nice new gas cooker. It's alleged that she had just had this gas cooker installed, possibly by a friend who might not have been the most experienced. It's believed that a bolt connecting the cooker to the building's gas mains had been over-tightened to the point that it had cracked, which caused gas to silently leak into the flat throughout the night. Then when Miss Hodge went to boil her kettle that morning, the last thing she did was strike a match to light her stove, which caused a large explosion. By some miracle, she survived after being thrown backwards away from the blast. But the impact had pushed up part of her kitchen ceiling, detaching the floor slabs in the flat above from the outer walls of the building, and that was it. Horrifyingly, it all started to crumble and floor after floor began to fall like dominoes. Fortunately, it was mostly one corner of the building that was affected, and this is where the kitchens and living rooms are located. If it wasn't for this, paired with how early it was in the morning, more people would have been in those parts of the flats instead of asleep in their rooms. Another stroke of luck was that not all of the flats in the newly built tower block had been occupied yet, due to the building only being open to tenants a couple of months prior. It's only because of these things that the amount of injuries wasn't higher. Sadly, that didn't help one elderly woman who unfortunately passed away later in hospital. Or the poor married couple who had just moved into a flat on the very top floor. It was said that they didn't even really want to be there. They'd already rejected the flat 8 times before reluctantly having to accept it when they discovered the home they were living in was going to be demolished. The public's faith in tower blocks quickly plummeted, and concerns started to grow over the safety of these new buildings that had been hastily thrown up all over London. An inquiry was swiftly commissioned by the government to understand what had gone so dreadfully wrong that an incident in one property could bring down all the floors of a building. This was known as the Griffiths inquiry, and although the tower block was found to have been built to current regulations, what it uncovered was truly shocking. The inquiry found that the building was always a structural risk, and the walls were susceptible to not only any subsequent blasts, but also fires. And most scarily, even just the pressure from the wind could be a risk to the integrity of the walls. One architect even predicted that the building only had around a 15-year lifespan before it could collapse entirely. The inquiry resulted in tons of recommendations that needed to be implemented, and this went on to shape UK building regulations, ensuring for safer housing going into the future. Ronan Point was quickly rebuilt, incorporating the new safety standards and rules, which included strengthening the joints and banning gas altogether, only allowing residents to have electric cookers and heating instead. But it wasn't enough to make residents feel safe, and many point-blank refused to go back at all. Would you feel safe enough to go back and live in these flats? Let us know in the comments. For those who had to live in Ronan Point after everything that had happened, life was uncomfortable, not just because of the safety worries keeping them up at night, but they also had a whole heap of other issues to contend with. The lifts were unreliable and would often break down, sometimes trapping people inside. Damp was a constant problem, with one resident saying that workers had to come and drill holes in her ceiling every time it rained to release the built-up water. Signs of damp and mould were soon spotted everywhere, and cracks were appearing around people's ceilings. There was even infestations of cockroaches and pests, making it just a miserable place to be. But perhaps most worryingly of all, for those who lived up on the higher floors, the building would noticeably sway and swing from side to side in the wind. After everything that was revealed in the inquiry, residents were beyond worried, but still they had little choice at this point other than to put up with it. Even when they could visibly see their hanging kitchen utensils and items swinging ominously from side to side. Their carpets would even blow and flap in the wind, and fish tanks always had a slanted waterline. There was also an investigation after residents said that they could smell food from other people's cooking coming from the flats around them, which found bowing between the floor slabs and the external walls had caused gaps that shouldn't be there. This meant that if there was ever a fire, it would have only taken a couple of minutes for smoke and other toxic fumes to spread through the building. The tenants had had enough. They wanted out and had started a petition which gathered tons of support. They presented it to East Ham Town Hall, and after some initial reluctance, their concerns were finally listened to. After everything that had happened, and with all of the problems that the block was still facing even after being partially rebuilt, the council finally agreed to put an end to their nightmare and evacuated all residents from the building. They were determined that lessons would be learnt from what went wrong here. After all, Ronan Point wasn't alone. It was one of many almost identical tower blocks that contained hundreds of individual flats, which housed thousands of tenants who all needed to know that their homes were safe to live in. The building research department was allowed to conduct tests on Ronan Point to stop anything like this from ever happening again. During one experiment, a controlled fire was set in a single flat to determine fire safety, but the test had to be stopped a little after 10 minutes because of how quickly it got out of hand and started spreading up the outside of the tower. In 1986, Ronan Point was demolished, but as part of the continued investigation, it was decided that it would be dismantled piece by piece so that each part of the structure could be examined. That's when they discovered the true horror of how the place had been constructed. As they carefully removed sections of the tower, they revealed the disturbing extent of cost-cutting and bad workmanship that had taken place. There were bolts that were damaged or rusted, which caused cracking around them, and unbelievably, some bolts were missing altogether. They also found that most of the joints between the walls and floor slabs weren't properly connected when it was built. There was also significant cracking forming towards the base of the tower as it was built on insufficient supports, and steel bars that had been wrongly positioned. They also found large voids that should have been filled with concrete, instead had been stuffed with newspaper, old tin cans, cigarette packets, crumpled cement bags, polystyrene and other rubbish. And to everyone's shock, one of the newspapers they found shoved in the voids was alarmingly dated September 1972. meaning it wasn't part of the original construction, but put there during the rebuild when it was meant to be taking extra measures to strengthen and fix the building. Perhaps one of the biggest miracles that occurred from all of this is that the building was demolished and the failings were discovered in 1986. Less than 1 year before the Great Storm of 1987, which surely would have led to the building's collapse and would have been an absolute catastrophe had the block have been fully occupied at the time. The nation was shocked and appalled by the findings at Ronan Point. It ushered in new legislation and changed Britain's building regulations forever. But it brought up larger questions around social housing, and there were many political undertones that I haven't gone into in this video. But I would strongly recommend having a read through Duncan Tanner's 2022 prize-winning essay, The Ronan Point Scandal, Architecture, Crisis and Possibility in British Social Democracy, if you're interested in gaining a deeper understanding of the political, social and economic motivations that ran parallel to this event. I'd also suggest checking out Ricky Chambers' 2018 documentary, And Then We Heard Shouts and Cries, which features the words of those who were there and really helps you understand what the residents went through that day. To forget Ronan Point is to risk repeating it. We remember not only to honour the victims, but to protect Britain's housing for future generations.